The Mafia boss hid cameras to protect his paralyzed daughter, until he saw what the maid did in the empty hours when she thought no one was watching. Bramwell Rossi stood in his study at 3 a.m, surrounded by monitors that showed every angle of his mansion, his finger hovering over the playback button with a dread he couldn't name. The security company had installed the final camera that afternoon, transforming his home into a grid of digital eyes that never blinked, never slept, never failed to capture every moment of vulnerability his daughter would experience. He'd told himself this was protection, that any father would do the same when their child needed constant care and vigilance. But the weight in his chest suggested he was building something closer to a prison than a sanctuary. The mansion sprawled across grounds that could swallow smaller estates whole, each room decorated with wealth that stopped conversations when visitors first entered. Marble floors reflected light from chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in years, every surface gleaming with obsessive maintenance. Bramwell had acquired this property the same way he'd built his empire, through calculated moves combining legitimate business with shadowy operations. His real estate holdings stretched across the city, towers and developments bearing respectable names while generating revenue streams that never appeared in official reports. The mansion served as the crown jewel of his public image, where a successful entrepreneur lived with his daughter, far removed from basement meetings. Addie had come home from the hospital 16 months ago, carried in his arms like something made of glass that might shatter. The doctors had used careful language that couldn't hide the permanence of her condition, explaining how complications during delivery had affected her mobility. She'd been so small, her legs resting motionless beneath the blanket, while her dark eyes tracked his face with awareness. Bramwell had stood in the nursery he'd prepared, surrounded by equipment recommended by specialists, and felt the future he'd imagined dissolve. The business associates who'd sent flowers never asked about her condition twice, their discomfort with imperfection wrapped in polite distance. His world operated on strength and the appearance of invulnerability, qualities that didn't accommodate weakness or need for assistance. Addie's condition represented a crack in the armor he'd spent decades constructing, a vulnerability his enemies could exploit if they understood how completely she'd captured his heart. The cameras were supposed to eliminate blind spots, create perfect awareness of every threat that might approach his daughter while he managed operations. Bramwell had gone through 7 caregivers in 14 months, each one failing tests they didn't know they were taking. The first had been too rough when changing Addie, her movements efficient but lacking gentleness he couldn't articulate but recognized instantly. The second had talked on her phone during feeding times, her attention divided when his daughter deserved complete focus. 3 others had lasted weeks before revealing themselves as unsuitable through small betrayals captured on the surveillance system. One had eaten food from the kitchen without asking, treating his home like her personal pantry rather than respecting professional boundaries. Another had invited a friend to visit during work hours, introducing unauthorized presence into his daughter's protected environment without permission. The 6th caregiver had been competent but cold, providing adequate physical care while offering nothing of warmth or connection. Bramwell had watched through cameras as she'd perform duties with mechanical precision, never singing, never speaking beyond necessary instructions. Addie had grown quieter during those weeks, her expressive eyes losing some of their light in ways that made his chest constrict. He'd dismissed that woman on a Tuesday morning, standing in the foyer while she collected her belongings with wounded dignity. The agency had stopped returning his calls after that, their polite refusal wrapped in claims about liability and difficult client relationships. Bramwell had turned to private networks instead, putting word out through channels that operated below official oversight and attracted candidates with complicated histories. The responses had come quickly, desperate applications from women whose circumstances made them willing to work for someone with his reputation. He'd interviewed 5 before Cassidy knocked on his door 3 weeks ago, her knuckles creating a pattern against wood that somehow sounded different from every knock that had come before. She'd stood on his doorstep in jeans and a pressed shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a simple style that framed features marked by experience rather than youth. Her references were minimal, her work history containing gaps she didn't immediately explain, her overall presentation suggesting someone running from something. But when she'd spoken, her voice had carried a quality that made him pause mid-dismissal, something in her tone suggesting depths he hadn't expected. She'd answered his standard questions with responses that revealed intelligence carefully hidden beneath working-class vocabulary and deliberate simplicity. Then she'd done something none of the others had thought to do, something so unexpected it had shifted the entire interview's trajectory. She'd looked directly at him with eyes that held their own evaluation, and asked if she could meet Addie before accepting the position. not after being hired, not as a formality during orientation, but as a condition of her agreement to work in his home. The request had caught him completely off guard, disrupting the power dynamic he'd maintained throughout every previous interview without effort. Bramwell had studied her face for signs of manipulation, searching for the angle that would reveal this as strategy rather than genuine interest. But Cassidy had simply waited, her posture relaxed, her expression open, offering no explanation that might undermine the simplicity of her request. He'd led her upstairs to the nursery where Addie spent most of her waking hours, surrounded by toys she rarely touched and equipment that assisted her limited mobility. His daughter had been lying on the padded mat where the previous caregiver had left her, her gaze fixed on the ceiling with the patient stillness she'd developed over months of immobility. Cassidy had entered the room and immediately dropped to the floor, lowering herself until she was at eye level with Addie rather than towering above her. The gesture had been so natural, so instinctive, that Bramwell had felt something shift in his chest before he could prevent the reaction. Cassidy had introduced herself to Addie in a soft voice that carried none of the bright falseness adults often used with children, speaking to her as a person rather than a problem to be managed. She'd asked permission before touching Addie's hand, waiting for some sign of acceptance before making physical contact. Addie's response had been immediate and unmistakable, her fingers curling around Cassidy's with a grip that spoke of recognition rather than reflex. The baby's eyes had focused with an intensity Bramwell hadn't seen in weeks, tracking Cassidy's face as if memorizing features that mattered in ways others hadn't. Cassidy had smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face, and begun describing what she noticed about Addie's responses with detail that suggested professional training she hadn't mentioned in her sparse application. Bramwell had hired her on the spot, overriding every instinct that screamed about unknown variables and insufficient vetting of her background. The cameras would reveal whatever secrets she carried, would expose any threat she represented before damage could occur. He'd told himself this justified the risk, that surveillance provided safety net against his own uncharacteristic impulsiveness in hiring someone so obviously hiding significant portions of her history. Cassidy had arrived for her first official day on a morning when rain streaked the windows in patterns that blurred the manicured grounds beyond. She'd knocked at precisely 7 o'clock, her punctuality suggesting discipline that contradicted her casual presentation and working-class background. Bramwell had opened the door to find her standing with a small backpack and an expression of quiet determination that made him wonder what she'd overcome just to reach his doorstep. He'd shown her through the mansion's main floor, pointing out rooms she'd need to access and areas that remained strictly off-limits. The West Wing housed his private office, and the security center where monitors displayed every camera feed in real-time surveillance. She'd nodded at each instruction without asking questions that might reveal curiosity about aspects of his life beyond Addie's care, her focus remaining narrowly professional. The tour had ended in Addie's nursery, where morning light filled the space with a warmth the rest of the house seemed to lack. Cassidy had set her backpack down and immediately gone to Addie, repeating the floor-level greeting that had characterized their first meeting. She'd begun her routine with a naturalness that suggested years of experience, checking Addie's comfort, assessing her mood, engaging her attention with gentle conversation that required no verbal response. Bramwell had lingered in the doorway longer than intended, watching Cassidy work with a competence that went beyond basic caregiving into something approaching artistry. She'd sung while organizing Addie's clothes, her voice carrying melodies he hadn't heard in years, songs his own mother had sung when he was young. The unexpected connection to his past had created discomfort he couldn't name, a sense that this woman was bringing elements into his home that had been deliberately excluded. He'd forced himself to leave, to return to his office where legitimate business demanded attention, and the morning's meetings required his strategic mind. But throughout conference calls and contract reviews, part of his awareness had remained fixed on the monitors showing Cassidy's activities. She'd moved through caregiving tasks with efficiency that freed time for what appeared to be her true focus, engaging Addie in ways that treated her as a participant rather than a passive recipient of care. Bramwell had watched her pull a small notebook from her backpack and begin writing observations about Addie's responses to different stimuli. She documented which toys captured attention, which sounds produced smiles, which movements seemed to cause discomfort that needed addressing. The level of detail suggested someone trained in developmental assessment or therapeutic techniques, skills far beyond what a simple domestic employee would possess or need for basic childcare duties. Over the following days, the notebook had grown thick with entries that Cassidy reviewed before each interaction with Addie. She'd begun adapting her approach based on patterns she'd identified, positioning toys at specific angles that maximized Addie's ability to interact with them. She'd introduced textured materials during playtime, letting Addie explore different sensations that seemed to spark increasing engagement and curiosity. The most striking change had come in Addie herself, who'd begun vocalizing more frequently in Cassidy's presence than she had in months. The baby's sounds weren't words yet, but they carried intention and emotion that had been largely absent during previous caregivers' tenures. She'd started reaching for objects with greater determination, her upper body strength visibly increasing as Cassidy encouraged movements that built muscle and coordination. Bramwell had found himself spending more time reviewing footage than conducting business, his attention captured by scenes playing out in his daughter's room. He'd watched Cassidy massage Addie's legs with a technique that looked professionally trained, her hands moving in patterns that suggested knowledge of therapeutic practice. The massage sessions lasted 20 minutes twice daily, Cassidy maintaining conversation throughout that kept Addie engaged and distracted from any discomfort the manipulation might cause. The discovery of Cassidy's technique had raised new questions about her background and the training she'd clearly received, but never mentioned during her interview. Physical therapy wasn't something learned casually, wasn't a skill acquired without formal education and supervised practice. The gap between what she'd presented and what she clearly knew had widened into a chasm that demanded explanation, even as results with Addie made him reluctant to disrupt their developing routine. 3 weeks into Cassidy's employment, Bramwell had noticed her leaving items in rooms beyond the nursery, small signs of presence that suggested growing comfort. A sweater draped over the library chair, a book left on the kitchen counter, personal belongings gradually spreading through spaces she'd initially treated with cautious respect. The territorial expansion had triggered alarms in his mind about boundaries and professional distance that needed maintaining regardless of her effectiveness with Addie. He'd mentioned this during their first face-to-face conversation beyond initial instructions, catching her in the hallway as she returned from the market. Cassidy had apologized immediately, gathering her scattered possessions with embarrassment that seemed genuine rather than performed. But in collecting her things, she'd pulled items from the library table that included a photograph Bramwell hadn't seen her bring into the house, an image that froze his breath in his chest when he glimpsed it. The photograph showed a young man in his early 20s, his features bearing enough similarity to Cassidy to mark him as family. He stood beside what looked like a medical facility, his smile wide despite surroundings that suggested ongoing treatment or therapy. Something about the image triggered recognition in Bramwell's mind, a nagging sense that he'd encountered this face before, in contexts that had nothing to do with domestic employees or their personal histories. Cassidy had snatched the photograph back quickly, tucking it into her backpack with protective haste that confirmed its importance to her. But not before Bramwell had noticed the address written on the back, in careful handwriting, numbers and street name, identifying a location in the city's eastern district. That neighborhood carried associations with his business operations, territories where his legitimate holdings bordered areas controlled through less official means that kept competition properly managed and revenue streams protected from interference. The coincidence seemed too precise to dismiss, too specifically connected to his world to represent random chance or innocent explanation. Bramwell had let Cassidy retreat without pressing for details, but his mind had already begun cataloging possibilities and running calculations. That evening, after Addie had been settled for sleep and Cassidy had departed for her own residence, he'd pulled up records that connected addresses to names and names to histories his organization maintained for operational security. The search had taken less than 30 minutes to reveal connections that rearranged everything he'd assumed about his daughter's caregiver and her motivations. The address on the photograph belonged to a rehabilitation facility that specialized in long-term recovery from traumatic injuries. The young man in the picture was Marcus Webb, Cassidy's younger brother, who'd been admitted 14 months ago following an incident that had left him with injuries requiring extensive ongoing treatment. The incident's details were documented in reports Bramwell kept for situations requiring his direct awareness and approval for organizational response. Marcus Webb had been present during a dispute between competing factions over territory in the Eastern District, caught in crossfire that had nothing to do with him personally. He'd been working security for a business that operated in the contested zone, simply standing at his post when violence had erupted around him in ways his training couldn't have anticipated or prevented. Bramwell's people hadn't been directly responsible for the shooting, but they'd been involved in the broader conflict that had created the conditions. The realization settled in his stomach like poisoned weight, understanding crystallizing that Cassidy's presence in his home wasn't the coincidence he'd initially accepted. She'd come seeking something, access or revenge or leverage, her competence with Addie potentially serving purposes that had nothing to do with caregiving and everything to do with settling scores his world had created in her life. The monitors in Bramwell's office became an obsession that consumed hours he should have dedicated to business operations requiring his strategic oversight. He'd begun reviewing footage with forensic intensity, searching for evidence of Cassidy's true intentions beyond the caregiving that appeared so flawlessly executed. Every interaction with Addie was analyzed for signs of manipulation. Every moment alone in rooms scrutinized for suspicious behavior that would confirm his growing paranoia about her hidden agenda and ultimate goals. But the surveillance revealed nothing that supported his suspicions, only deepening the mystery of what Cassidy actually wanted from her position in his household. She'd never entered his office or attempted to access areas beyond her legitimate responsibilities, never searched through documents or photographed anything that might provide intelligence value. Her focus remained entirely on Addie, her attention never wavering toward the aspects of his home that would interest someone gathering information for leverage or planning retaliation. Bramwell had watched her read stories to Addie with animated voices that made his daughter's eyes shine with delight and engagement. She'd created elaborate games that encouraged reaching and grasping, building upper body strength through play that disguised therapeutic exercise as entertainment. The notebook she maintained had expanded to include sketches of Addie's progress, visual documentation of incremental improvements that careful observation revealed, even when dramatic changes remained absent from day-to-day reality. One recording showed Cassidy singing lullabies while rocking Addie to sleep, her voice carrying aching tenderness that seemed to transcend professional duty. She'd stroked Addie's hair with gentle repetition, her expression unguarded in the assumed privacy of the darkened nursery. Tears had tracked down Cassidy's face while she'd sung, grief or longing written in every line of her features, as she'd held someone else's child with a desperation that spoke of profound personal loss she carried constantly beneath her composed exterior. The emotional display had struck Bramwell with unexpected force, recognizing in Cassidy's face an echo of his own hidden anguish over Addie's condition. He'd paused the footage, studying her expression frozen in the monitor's glow, seeing past the surface competence to the wounded person beneath. Whatever had brought Cassidy to his door, whatever connection to his world had motivated her application, it coexisted with genuine care for his daughter that couldn't be entirely fabricated or performed for the cameras she didn't know were capturing every vulnerable moment. Another clip showed Cassidy on the floor with Addie, both of them surrounded by foam blocks and soft toys in rainbow colors. She'd built elaborate structures that Addie could knock down with sweeping arm movements, celebrating each destruction with enthusiasm that made the baby laugh. The laughter had been rare enough to startle Bramwell when he'd first heard it through the monitor's speakers. His daughter's joy so unfamiliar it had taken him a moment to recognize the sound as happiness rather than distress. Cassidy had introduced music during therapy sessions, playing different genres while she worked Addie's legs through range-of-motion exercises that maintained flexibility and circulation. She'd apparently researched how rhythm and melody could enhance therapeutic outcomes, creating playlists that corresponded to specific types of movement. The attention to detail revealed someone who'd studied beyond basic caregiving, who'd sought specialized knowledge that would maximize her effectiveness in addressing needs that went far beyond simple supervision and daily maintenance routines. Bramwell had discovered recordings of Cassidy talking to Addie about her own day, sharing observations about weather and small incidents from market trips. She'd described people they'd encountered, mimicking voices and expressions in ways that made Addie smile with recognition of the storytelling performance. The monologue served no therapeutic purpose he could identify, existed only to provide Addie with connection to the world beyond her limited physical sphere and social isolation. The most compelling footage showed Cassidy lying beside Addie during afternoon rest periods, her body stretched on the mat so they were face-to-face at equal height. She'd traced Addie's features with a fingertip light as breath, mapping the contours of her face while reciting poetry in Italian that Bramwell's own grandmother had spoken. The language choice had been inexplicable until he'd remembered Marcus Webb's file mentioning his mother's Italian heritage, connections to the community that had immigrated decades ago, and maintained cultural traditions across generations. Cassidy had been teaching Addie her family's language, passing down words and sounds that connected his daughter to roots she'd never know through him alone. The realization had created a complex tangle of emotions Bramwell couldn't easily separate or name, gratitude mixing with resentment that a stranger was providing cultural enrichment he'd never considered. His own Italian heritage had been deliberately buried beneath the American identity he'd cultivated for business purposes, ethnic connections viewed as liability rather than asset in the empire he'd built through calculated assimilation and strategic distance from immigrant origins. He'd watched Cassidy read to Addie from children's books, her dramatic interpretations transforming simple stories into theatrical performances that held his daughter's complete attention. She'd used different voices for each character, acting out scenes with exaggerated gestures that made narrative come alive. The books she'd chosen weren't from Addie's existing collection, but ones she'd purchased herself, titles that focused on characters overcoming obstacles and finding strength through persistence and courage. The thematic pattern wasn't subtle, wasn't coincidental in its consistent message about resilience and determination, despite circumstances that seemed limiting. Cassidy was telling Addie stories about her own potential, building a narrative foundation that framed her condition as challenge rather than definition. The psychological groundwork being laid would shape how his daughter understood herself for years to come, forming self-concept during the crucial early period when identity first coalesced around experience and reflected perception from caregivers. Bramwell had found footage of Cassidy creating art projects with materials that accommodated Addie's physical limitations while encouraging creative expression. Finger painting became full-palm exploration of texture and color, the mess containing sensory learning that traditional approaches would have minimized. She'd hung Addie's creations on the nursery walls, creating a gallery that celebrated every attempt regardless of aesthetic outcome, teaching that value existed in the trying rather than requiring perfect execution or conventional beauty standards. The surveillance had captured a moment when Cassidy had received a phone call that clearly delivered difficult news about something in her personal life. She'd stepped into the hallway for privacy, her voice low, but her distress visible in body language that broadcast emotional impact. The conversation had lasted less than 3 minutes before she'd ended the call and returned to the nursery, her composed mask sliding back into place with visible effort that suggested years of practice, hiding pain from observation. She'd picked up Addie and held her close, seeking comfort from the child she was supposed to be caring for, rather than vice versa. The role reversal had lasted only seconds before Cassidy had caught herself and resumed professional boundaries, but the slip had revealed the depth of her need for connection and the isolation she inhabited. Whatever hardships Cassidy faced in her life beyond his walls, she carried them alone without support system or safety net that might ease the burden. Bramwell had reviewed recordings of evening routines where Cassidy prepared Addie for sleep, with rituals that had become consistent enough to provide security. Bath time followed specific sequences, each step performed in the same order with the same songs and gentle handling. She'd developed a nighttime massage routine that relaxed Addie's body, while the soft-spoken narration of the day's events provided cognitive closure and reinforced memory formation through repetitive storytelling that highlighted positive moments and diminished any distress. The care Cassidy provided went so far beyond contractual obligations that Bramwell had found himself questioning what motivated such complete devotion to another person's child. Professional pride didn't explain the tears she'd shed in private moments, or the tenderness she showed when no one was supposedly watching. Compensation certainly couldn't account for the emotional investment visible in every interaction, the way she'd integrated Addie into her heart, rather than simply performing required duties with competent detachment. His investigation into her background had expanded beyond the initial discovery about Marcus, pulling records that revealed a life marked by loss and struggle that had honed rather than broken her. Cassidy had lost her mother to cancer 3 years ago, her father to a construction accident before that, leaving her solely responsible for Marcus's care when the shooting had shattered his body and obliterated the future he'd been building. The medical bills were astronomical, the rehabilitation facility's monthly costs exceeding anything ordinary employment could cover, without multiple jobs and desperate financial acrobatics. The salary Bramwell paid was generous by conventional standards, but barely adequate against the debt she was attempting to manage through sheer determination. He'd found evidence of her working night shifts at a diner before taking this position, supplementing inadequate income through sleep deprivation and relentless hustle. The job with him had apparently allowed her to quit the restaurant work, but the financial pressure remained visible in the worn clothing she wore and the careful way she made every dollar stretch beyond reasonable expectations. Bramwell had returned to the library on a Thursday afternoon, seeking a contract that required his signature before the evening's deadline. The leather chair where he usually worked held Cassidy's forgotten sweater, the gray cardigan she'd been wearing that morning when the weather had been cooler than the afternoon's warmth. He'd picked it up intending to set it aside, but something had fallen from the pocket, landing on the Persian rug with a soft thud that drew his attention downward. The leather journal was small enough to fit in a palm, its cover worn from repeated handling and years of use. Bramwell had known immediately he shouldn't open it, that whatever private thoughts it contained deserved the respect of remaining unread by unauthorized eyes. But the need to understand Cassidy's true motivations had overridden ethical considerations that might have stopped him in different circumstances, justifying the invasion as necessary security measures rather than simple curiosity about the woman who'd become indispensable to his daughter's happiness. The first pages contained sketches of Marcus at various stages of his recovery, medical notes written in margins beside drawings that captured his deterioration and slow rebuilding. Cassidy had documented every setback and minor victory, creating a visual diary of her brother's journey through pain toward uncertain future. Her handwriting grew shaky in entries describing the worst days, when infection had threatened his life, or despair had made him refuse treatment that offered the only possibility of eventual independence. Later pages shifted to observations about Addie, the transition marked by a date that corresponded to Cassidy's first day in Bramwell's household. She'd written about the baby's responses with clinical precision that revealed her therapeutic training hadn't been informal or accidental. Notes referenced specific developmental milestones and adaptive techniques, terminology that belonged to physical therapy professionals rather than casual caregivers who'd picked up skills through experience alone. But interspersed with the professional observations were personal reflections that exposed Cassidy's emotional state with raw honesty she clearly never intended for outside reading. She'd written about the guilt of loving Addie when Marcus remained trapped in his damaged body, the conflict between caring for this child and visiting her brother who needed her presence, but received only her exhausted leftover hours. The divided loyalty was tearing her apart in ways she couldn't share with anyone, isolation compounding the grief already weighing her down. One entry described her decision to seek employment with Bramwell specifically, the calculated choice to enter the home of someone whose organization had created the circumstances that destroyed her brother's future. She'd written about the anger that still burned beneath her professional composure, the desire for him to understand what his world had cost people who'd never chosen involvement in his operations. But the entry ended with confusion about whether making him see would accomplish anything beyond satisfying her own need for acknowledgement, that his actions had consequences that echoed far beyond his immediate awareness. Bramwell had found pages where Cassidy questioned her own motivations, wondering if her care for Addie was genuine or contaminated by the revenge she'd initially sought. She'd written about the moment she'd realized she loved the baby independent of any connection to Bramwell, the terror of that attachment given how temporary her position necessarily was. The job couldn't last forever, not when every day in his home meant lying by omission about her identity and the history that connected their families through violence and permanent damage. A loose photograph had been tucked between pages near the journal's center, the image showing Cassidy and Marcus together before the shooting had altered their trajectory. They'd been at some outdoor celebration, both smiling with an ease that spoke of life before trauma had redefined everything. Marcus's arm had been slung around Cassidy's shoulders, his expression open and full of the confidence youth provided before experience taught harder lessons about vulnerability and how quickly safety could vanish. The back of the photograph bore an address written in fading ink, numbers matching the rehabilitation facility where Marcus remained under constant medical supervision. But below the address, Cassidy had written a second location, this one corresponding to a property Bramwell owned in the Eastern District where the shooting had occurred. The notation suggested she'd tracked the connections between his holdings and her brother's injury, mapping the web of business relationships that had created the contested territory where Marcus had been working when violence had erupted. Bramwell had replaced the journal in the sweater pocket with hands that trembled slightly, evidence of how completely the discovery had undermined his assumptions. Cassidy hadn't come seeking revenge through harm to Addie, or theft of business intelligence, but rather something more complicated and perhaps more dangerous. She'd wanted proximity to understand him, to see if the man whose empire had casually destroyed her family recognized the humanity of people crushed beneath his operation's expansion and territorial disputes. He'd spent the following 3 days reviewing footage with new understanding, seeing Cassidy's interactions through the lens of her hidden pain and complicated motivations. The tenderness she showed Addie wasn't purely professional or even entirely personal, but also a form of bearing witness to the capacity for care that existed alongside the capacity for destruction. She was proving to herself that people connected to violence could still nurture, that the world wasn't divided simply into victims and perpetrators without overlap or complexity. Bramwell had caught himself watching Cassidy's face during the recordings, studying her expressions for signs of the turmoil the journal had revealed. She masked her feelings with remarkable effectiveness, her professional demeanor rarely cracking to expose the grief and anger churning underneath. But small moments betrayed her, brief flashes of pain that crossed her features when she thought herself unobserved, tension in her shoulders that spoke of exhaustion, beyond the physical demands of caregiving responsibilities. The surveillance had captured a morning when Cassidy had arrived with redness around her eyes, suggesting recent tears, her movements slightly slower than her usual efficient pace. She'd gone directly to Addie and held her close, seeking the comfort the baby provided simply through her warm weight and absolute acceptance. Cassidy had whispered something too quiet for the microphone to capture, her lips moving against Addie's hair in what might have been prayer or confession, or simply the release of words that couldn't be contained any longer. That afternoon, Bramwell had found himself in the nursery doorway, watching the real-time scene rather than the monitored version. Drawn by impulse, he didn't examine too closely. Cassidy had been reading to Addie from a new book about a young bird learning to fly despite damaged wings, the metaphor so obvious it bordered on painful. Her voice had carried layers of meaning beyond the simple story, inflecting words with weight that spoke to her own struggles and damaged hopes. She'd looked up and seen him standing there, her expression shifting through surprise into careful neutrality that hid whatever reaction his presence had triggered. The moment had stretched between them, heavy with all the unspoken knowledge Bramwell carried about her history and true identity. He'd wanted to confront her about the journal, about Marcus and the rehabilitation facility, and the real reason she'd knocked on his door, but the words had stuck in his throat when he'd seen how Addie had turned at the sound of his footsteps. His daughter had reached toward him with both arms extended, a gesture of inclusion she'd started making since Cassidy had been modeling interactive behaviors. But her eyes had immediately returned to Cassidy's face, checking for the woman's presence with an anxiety that suggested she'd learned people disappeared without warning. The attachment between them had grown so complete that Addie's security now depended on Cassidy's continued presence, creating a vulnerability Bramwell hadn't anticipated when he'd hired her. He'd retreated without speaking, the weight of his knowledge about Cassidy's motives, combining with awareness of how essential she'd become to Addie's well-being. The surveillance system that was supposed to provide protection and control had instead revealed a situation far more complicated than simple employee oversight. Cassidy's care was genuine despite her initial intentions, but those intentions still existed beneath the surface, unresolved anger waiting to manifest in ways he couldn't predict or prevent through monitoring alone. That evening, Bramwell had made a decision that went against every instinct his world had cultivated over decades of surviving through paranoia and preemptive action. He would continue employing Cassidy without confronting her about the journal or his knowledge of her connection to Marcus's injury, allowing the situation to develop naturally rather than forcing a confrontation that might destroy what she'd built with Addie. The choice felt dangerous and foolish, trusting someone with hidden motives to remain in his home with access to his daughter. But the alternative meant dismissing the only person who'd brought light back into Addie's eyes, the only caregiver who'd treated his daughter as someone with potential rather than merely limitations. The surveillance would continue, would document any shift in Cassidy's behavior that suggested threat to his family. He'd watch and wait, prepared to act if necessary, but hoping that somehow the genuine care he'd witnessed would prove stronger than the revenge she'd initially sought when entering his world. The manila envelope had arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by courier to Bramwell's office downtown rather than the mansion where such packages normally appeared. His assistant had placed it on his desk with the rest of the day's correspondence, nothing about its exterior suggesting the disruption its contents would create. But when he'd opened it during a rare quiet moment between meetings, photographs had spilled across the polished wood surface like evidence at a crime scene, black and white images that captured Cassidy in contexts that had nothing to do with caregiving. The surveillance wasn't his own, but clearly professional, taken by someone who'd been following Cassidy during her off hours when she left his employment for the night. She'd been photographed entering the rehabilitation facility where Marcus resided, her face showing exhaustion she never displayed in Addie's presence. Other images showed her at a diner in the Eastern District, sitting across from men whose faces Bramwell recognized from his organization's lower operational levels, people who handled street-level business that kept his empire's foundation intact through enforcement and collection activities. A typed note had accompanied the photographs, unsigned but clearly from someone within his own network who'd taken initiative to investigate the woman caring for his daughter. The message was brief and pointed, noting that Cassidy had been asking questions about the shooting that injured her brother, specifically about who'd given orders that led to the confrontation. She'd been careful, indirect, but her interest in the incident had been persistent enough to raise concerns among people who understood that curiosity about such matters often preceded retaliation or cooperation with law enforcement. Bramwell had felt ice spread through his chest, recognizing the danger Cassidy had placed herself in through her investigation into his operations. The men she'd been questioning weren't people who tolerated perceived threats, weren't employees who'd consider her youth or grief as mitigating factors against suspected betrayal. If they decided she represented risk to the organization, her connection to his daughter wouldn't necessarily protect her from consequences that came swiftly and permanently to those deemed problematic. He'd gathered the photographs and returned them to the envelope, his mind already calculating responses to a situation that had escalated beyond his control. Cassidy had been more active in seeking answers than the journal had suggested, her presence in his home only one aspect of a broader campaign to understand the violence that had destroyed her family. The discovery meant he could no longer maintain passive observation, couldn't simply watch through cameras while she potentially drew danger toward herself and, by extension, toward Addie. That evening, Bramwell had waited in the entrance hall for Cassidy's arrival, positioning himself where she couldn't avoid the conversation he'd been postponing for weeks. She'd knocked at her usual time, entering with the backpack she carried, and the professional smile she wore like armor against the world. But the smile had faltered when she'd seen him standing there instead of retreating to his office, her body language shifting into defensive readiness that confirmed she'd been expecting this confrontation eventually. He'd held up the envelope without opening it, letting her see the courier markings that indicated its professional origin rather than accidental discovery. Cassidy's face had drained of color, her hands gripping the backpack straps with enough force to whiten her knuckles. The silence between them had stretched until it became unbearable, neither willing to speak first and admit to knowledge that couldn't be taken back once voiced into the space they'd both been pretending was uncomplicated. Bramwell had broken first, his voice colder than he'd intended when he'd asked what she thought she was accomplishing by questioning his people about events she couldn't change. The accusation had emerged harsher than the professional concern he'd meant to express, anger surfacing that had less to do with her investigation and more to do with the fear that she'd placed herself in danger through actions he couldn't prevent or control, despite all his supposed power. Cassidy had lifted her chin, meeting his gaze with defiance that replaced the fear he'd seen initially cross her features. She'd asked if he knew what his business had cost people who'd never wanted involvement in his world, if he'd bothered to learn the names of those caught in his organization's territorial disputes. Her voice had carried bitterness that made clear how long she'd been holding back these words, the restraint she'd exercised finally breaking under the pressure of confrontation. The words had hit harder than physical blows, each question landing with precision that suggested she'd been rehearsing this speech for months. Bramwell had felt defensive walls rising, the justifications he'd built over years about necessary violence and acceptable collateral damage in business that operated outside conventional law. But the justifications had sounded hollow even in his own mind, when faced with Cassidy standing in his entrance hall, demanding he acknowledge the human cost of his choices. He'd told her she needed to stop asking questions, that the men she'd been approaching weren't safe to investigate, regardless of her motivations or her belief in the rightness of her cause. The warning had come out sounding like a threat, despite his intention to protect her, his inability to express concern without the language of control and power that dominated his professional interactions. Cassidy had laughed then, a bitter sound that held no humor, asking if he was threatening her now that she'd become inconvenient. The accusation had stung precisely because it contained enough truth to undermine his claims about protecting her from consequences beyond his control. Bramwell had been about to respond, to explain the distinction between threat and warning, when movement from the staircase had drawn both their attention upward. Addie's nighttime caregiver, the woman who took over when Cassidy left, had been standing at the top with the baby in her arms, clearly intending to bring her down for the evening routine Cassidy had established. Addie had seen Cassidy and immediately reached out, her small body straining toward the woman who'd become her primary source of security and affection. The baby's face had crumpled when Cassidy hadn't moved to take her, confusion and hurt visible in her expression at this break from expected routine. She'd begun making distressed sounds that escalated toward full crying, her arms still extended in a plea that neither adult could ignore without causing her additional pain. Cassidy had moved toward the stairs automatically, her body responding to Addie's need despite the unresolved confrontation hanging between her and Bramwell. But he'd stepped into her path, blocking her progress with a physical barrier that made clear his control over her access to his daughter. The gesture had been instinctive, a claim of authority that reasserted his power in a situation where he'd felt it slipping away through Cassidy's accusations and moral challenges. The moment had crystallized everything wrong in their arrangement, exposing how his need for control had created a situation where his daughter's well-being was being held hostage to adult conflicts. Cassidy had looked at him with an expression that combined pity and disgust, seeing through his action to the fear and inadequacy it attempted to conceal. She'd asked quietly if he understood that everything he thought he was protecting was already damaged by his inability to trust anyone enough to let them truly close. Bramwell had felt the truth of her words like physical impact, recognition that his surveillance and suspicion had created the exact isolation he'd been trying to prevent. Addie's crying had grown louder, her distress feeding on the tension between the two adults she depended on for different aspects of her care and emotional security. The sound had cut through his defensive anger, forcing him to choose between maintaining his position and responding to his daughter's immediate need. He'd stepped aside, allowing Cassidy to pass and climb the stairs to where Addie was being held by the temporary caregiver. The baby had practically launched herself into Cassidy's arms, her crying subsiding into hiccuping relief the moment she'd felt the familiar embrace. Cassidy had held her close, murmuring reassurances that everything was all right, her voice steady despite the trembling Bramwell could see in her shoulders from his position below. The temporary caregiver had retreated without being dismissed, clearly uncomfortable with the tension she'd walked into and eager to escape whatever confrontation was unfolding. Bramwell had been left standing at the base of the stairs watching Cassidy comfort his daughter, seeing how completely Addie had transferred her trust and primary attachment to someone he'd hired without understanding the emotional consequences. The depth of his daughter's need for Cassidy was undeniable, written in every line of her body as she clung to the woman who'd become her anchor. Cassidy had looked down at him over Addie's head, her expression unreadable in the entrance hall's dramatic lighting that cast half her face in shadow. She'd told him she'd finish Addie's bedtime routine, and then they could continue their conversation, the statement carrying authority that reversed their employer-employee dynamic completely. She'd climbed the remaining stairs without waiting for his permission or agreement, claiming temporary custody of the situation and his daughter, through the simple assertion that Addie's needs superseded their conflict. Bramwell had waited in the library while Cassidy had settled Addie for the night, the extended bedtime routine providing neither of them escape from the inevitable continuation of their confrontation. He'd poured whiskey he didn't drink, standing by the window that overlooked grounds where security lights created islands of illumination in surrounding darkness. The estate that usually felt like a fortress suddenly seemed like a prison of his own construction, walls designed to keep threats out, but actually keeping him isolated from genuine human connection. When Cassidy had finally appeared in the library doorway, her face showed the exhaustion of someone who'd been maintaining impossible facades for too long. She'd refused his gesture toward the chairs, remaining standing in a posture that suggested she expected this conversation to end with her dismissal, and had already prepared herself for that loss. Bramwell had recognized the defensive positioning, the way she'd braced for impact that her experience had taught her to anticipate from people who held power over her circumstances and employment. He'd asked her directly what she'd wanted when she'd first knocked on his door, bypassing any pretense that they could continue their previous arrangement without addressing the foundations of deception it had been built upon. Cassidy had met his question with her own, asking if he remembered Marcus Webb, or if the young man's injury had been too insignificant to register among the casualties his business operations created regularly. The counter-question had been a challenge and an accusation, demanding he acknowledge her brother's humanity before she'd answer anything about her own motivations or initial intentions. Bramwell had admitted he'd found her journal, that he'd known about Marcus for weeks, while watching her care for Addie with tenderness that seemed to contradict the anger she must have been carrying. The confession had been tactical, establishing that his knowledge was comprehensive, rather than based solely on the photographs delivered that morning. But it had also been surrender of sorts, acknowledging his own violation of her privacy, while expecting her to confess her deceptions in return, creating a strange parody in their mutual betrayals. Cassidy had absorbed his admission without visible reaction, as though she'd suspected the surveillance extended beyond what she could see into invasions she couldn't prevent. She told him she'd come seeking understanding of how someone could build a life that required looking away from the damage it caused, how a man could be a father while running operations that destroyed other people's families without apparent remorse or recognition. Her initial plan had been to confront him, once she'd understood him enough to make that confrontation meaningful, rather than simply cathartic for herself alone. But working with Addie had complicated everything, had made Cassidy care about the child, independent of any connection to Bramwell or desire for revenge against the organization that had harmed her brother. She'd found herself genuinely invested in Addie's development and happiness. Her professional skill, combining with personal investment to create attachment she hadn't anticipated or wanted, given how temporary her position would necessarily remain. The job had stopped being about Marcus and started being about the small girl who smiled at her each morning, who'd learned to trust her when trust had been broken so early in her young life. Bramwell had asked why Cassidy had been questioning his people, if her focus had shifted to genuine caregiving, rather than investigation into her brother's injury. The question had carried accusation, even as he'd tried to keep his tone neutral, suspicion about her divided loyalties, despite evidence that her care for Addie was authentic. Cassidy had explained she'd been trying to understand if there was anyone in his organization who regretted the violence, anyone who questioned the necessity of territorial disputes that caught innocent people in crossfire. She'd wanted to believe that people involved in his world weren't uniformly callous, that somewhere in the hierarchy were individuals who struggled with the moral weight of what they participated in for money or survival. The hope had been naive, she'd acknowledged, born from her need to believe the world wasn't as dark as her brother's injury suggested. But the men she'd questioned had viewed her curiosity as suspicious rather than philosophical, had interpreted her questions as preparation for revenge or cooperation with authorities, rather than simply a wounded person seeking evidence that humanity persisted in unexpected places. Bramwell had told her about the danger she'd created for herself through those inquiries, how the photographs indicated someone in his organization had decided she represented potential threat. His people didn't wait for threats to materialize, didn't offer second chances to those whose actions suggested disloyalty or plans for retaliation, regardless of how indirect or philosophical their questioning might have seemed. The protection his position offered only extended so far, especially if others decided her presence endangered the organization through what she might observe or eventually report to authorities who'd been trying to penetrate his operations for years. Cassidy had laughed again, that same bitter sound from earlier, asking if he was concerned for her safety or worried she'd become a liability that complicated his carefully controlled existence. The distinction mattered, she'd pressed, because it revealed whether he saw her as a person whose life had value beyond her utility to his daughter. Bramwell had found himself unable to answer with the quick assurance the question demanded, recognizing that his motivations were indeed mixed between genuine concern and self-interested worry about complications her situation introduced into his carefully managed world. The silence following his non-answer had said everything Cassidy needed to know about his priorities, and the limits of whatever regard he'd developed for her over the weeks she'd been working in his home. She'd set her backpack on the floor with finality, straightening with the posture of someone who'd made a difficult decision and would execute it regardless of personal cost. She'd told him she'd finish out the week to give him time to find suitable replacement, but that she couldn't continue in a position where her value was purely transactional and her safety was secondary to his organizational concerns and reputation management. Bramwell had felt panic rise in his throat, unexpected and overwhelming, at the prospect of Cassidy leaving and taking with her all the progress Addie had made under her care. He'd tried to articulate that her assessment of his concern was incomplete, that he did care about her well-being beyond her utility to his daughter, but the words had come out clumsy and unconvincing even to his own ears. His emotional vocabulary was too limited, too corrupted by years of viewing relationships through transactional lenses that reduced people to assets or threats, without space for complexity that characterized genuine human connection. Cassidy had picked up her backpack and moved toward the door, clearly done with conversation that was circling without resolution or movement toward understanding. But she'd paused at the threshold, looking back with an expression that held something like sympathy mixed with her disappointment. She'd told him he was exactly what she'd expected when she'd first come seeking him out. Exactly the kind of man who could look at the world he'd created and see only his own reflection, instead of recognizing the shadows his empire cast across other people's lives and futures. The assessment had landed with devastating accuracy, stripping away the justifications Bramwell had maintained about necessary violence and acceptable costs in pursuit of building something that would outlast him. Cassidy had seen through to the moral emptiness he'd been protecting through surveillance and control, the way he'd isolated himself so completely that even his daughter only accessed him through monitored feeds, rather than direct engagement and physical presence. She'd identified the fundamental problem that all his wealth and power couldn't solve, the human deficit that no amount of security could compensate for or cameras could document without exposing it. She'd left without waiting for response, her footsteps echoing through the mansion as she'd walked toward the entrance and the life she maintained beyond his walls. Bramwell had remained in the library listening to the sound of the front door closing, the quiet click, somehow thunderous in the silence it left behind. The house had felt emptier than it had even in the worst days after he'd brought Addie home from the hospital, the absence of Cassidy's presence already palpable despite her promise to return for the remaining days of the week. He'd returned to his office and pulled up the surveillance feeds, searching for comfort in the familiar routine of observation and monitoring. But the screen showed only empty rooms and silent hallways, nothing of substance to watch or analyze without Cassidy and Addie present, to provide the human element that made the monitoring feel purposeful rather than voyeuristic. The cameras captured everything except what mattered, documented surfaces without accessing the depths where real connection occurred beyond the reach of his technological control systems. The following morning, Cassidy had arrived precisely on time, her professional mask firmly in place as though their confrontation had never occurred. She'd greeted Bramwell with cool politeness that maintained boundaries while fulfilling the letter of her employment agreement for the remaining days she'd committed to working. Addie had responded to her arrival with evident joy that neither adult could witness without understanding what would be lost when Cassidy's departure became permanent at the week's end. Bramwell had watched through his monitors as Cassidy had gone through her routines with Addie, noting how nothing in her care had changed despite the knowledge that this was temporary now rather than ongoing. She'd maintained the same gentle patience, the same creative engagement, the same tender attention that had characterized her work from the beginning. But something had shifted in the energy between them that even the cameras could capture, a sadness underlying every interaction that spoke to goodbyes, already being mourned before they'd been officially said. Friday arrived with rain that matched the heaviness settling in Bramwell's chest, each hour bringing him closer to Cassidy's final departure from his home and Addie's life. He'd spent the week attempting to find replacement caregivers, conducting interviews with candidates who possessed impressive credentials, but lacked the indefinable quality that made Cassidy irreplaceable in ways he couldn't articulate to the agencies sending applicants. Each conversation had ended with him finding reasons to disqualify perfectly adequate professionals, recognizing he was sabotaging his own search because no one could measure up to standards he couldn't properly define or explain. Addie had sensed something wrong despite being too young to understand the concept of permanent goodbye, her normally bright demeanor clouded by anxiety that manifested in increased clinginess toward Cassidy. She'd cried when Cassidy had set her down to prepare lunch, reaching desperately for the woman who'd become her primary source of security and emotional regulation. The distress had been painful to witness through the monitors, Bramwell seeing his daughter's fear of abandonment playing out in real time, while he remained powerless in his office reviewing contracts that suddenly seemed meaningless compared to the crisis unfolding upstairs. That afternoon, he'd found himself standing outside Addie's room, listening to Cassidy sing the Italian lullabies that had become part of their daily routine together. Her voice had carried tremors that suggested she was fighting tears while maintaining composure for the child in her arms. Professional mask cracking under emotional weight she could no longer fully contain. The song had ended with silence more profound than simple absence of sound, a void that seemed to swallow all the warmth his home had accumulated during Cassidy's brief tenure within these walls. Bramwell had retreated to his office and made a decision that went against every principle of control and calculated strategy his success had been built upon over decades. He'd accessed financial records tracing back to the shooting that had injured Marcus, pulling up names of everyone involved in the territorial dispute that had created the conditions for that violence. The list had been longer than he'd remembered, encompassing more people across more levels of his organization than he'd realized participated in decisions that had seemed routine at the time they'd been made. Among the names was his own, his signature on documents authorizing the expansion into the Eastern District that had triggered the conflict between competing factions. He'd approved the operations knowing they'd likely result in confrontations, accepting violence as inevitable cost of growth and market control. But he'd never followed up on the casualties, never asked about the people caught in crossfire that wasn't aimed at them specifically, but had destroyed their futures nonetheless through pure proximity to conflicts they hadn't chosen or understood before impact changed everything. The recognition of his own culpability sat heavy in his chest, different from the abstract acknowledgement he'd carried before seeing Marcus's face in Cassidy's photograph and hearing her describe her brother's slow recovery from injuries that would mark him permanently. Abstract casualties had been easy to file away as unfortunate but necessary, statistics that didn't require emotional processing or moral reckoning. But Marcus Webb had become real through Cassidy's grief, had acquired humanity that made Bramwell's previous dismissal of such damage feel like the moral failure it actually was, rather than simply pragmatic business calculation. He'd spent hours that evening constructing something unprecedented in his professional history, a plan that involved actual accountability rather than damage control or image management. The framework included financial compensation for Marcus's ongoing care, arrangements for rehabilitation that extended beyond what standard insurance covered, and creation of oversight that would prevent similar incidents from occurring without his direct awareness and approval. But the plan felt inadequate even as he'd drafted it, too transactional to address the deeper harm his operations had caused across years of prioritizing expansion over consideration of human costs that seemed abstract when they didn't have faces or names or sisters who mourned them. When Cassidy had finished Addie's bedtime routine and descended the stairs for the last time as his employee, Bramwell had been waiting in the entrance hall with the folder containing everything he'd assembled. She'd paused on the bottom step, her backpack over her shoulder and her expression carefully neutral as she'd prepared to deliver whatever final words she'd rehearsed for this goodbye. But he'd spoken first, asking if she'd give him one more hour before leaving permanently, if she'd allow him to show her something that might change her understanding of his response to their confrontation and her brother's situation. Cassidy had hesitated, clearly torn between desire to escape cleanly and curiosity about what he could possibly offer that would matter after everything that had already been said. The calculation had played across her features visibly, her exhaustion making it harder to maintain the masks that usually hid her decision-making process from outside observation. Finally, she'd nodded, setting her backpack down with the weariness of someone who'd already emotionally departed, but couldn't quite resist this final chapter before closing the book on her time in his home completely. Bramwell had led her to his office, the space she'd never been invited to enter during all her weeks of employment in his household. The monitors still displayed their feeds from cameras throughout the mansion, including the nursery where Addie slept under the temporary caregiver's supervision. He'd seen Cassidy's gaze track across the screens, understanding dawning about the extent of surveillance she'd been subject to without her knowledge or consent, every private moment captured and preserved for his review and analysis. The violation was written clearly on her face, the betrayal of privacy that went beyond normal security into something approaching obsessive control over every aspect of his household environment. Bramwell hadn't tried to justify the surveillance, hadn't offered explanations about safety or necessary precautions that might have made it seem reasonable rather than invasive. Instead, he'd handed her the folder, asking her to read through what he'd prepared before making final decision about whether any possibility existed for her to reconsider the departure she'd planned. Cassidy had opened the folder with visible reluctance, her body language broadcasting skepticism about whatever contents could possibly change the fundamental problems that made her continued employment impossible. But as she'd read through the financial arrangements, the rehabilitation plans, the operational changes he'd outlined, her expression had shifted from dismissive to confused, to something approaching cautious hope that seemed to hurt her more than cynicism had. She'd looked up at him with questions in her eyes, asking what he expected in return for this sudden generosity toward her brother and acknowledgement of responsibility. The question had been fair, reflecting her experience in a world where nothing came without strings attached and gifts were usually disguised obligations that extracted more than they gave. Bramwell had told her the truth, that he expected nothing except the opportunity to prove he was capable of learning from the damage his choices had created. He wanted Marcus to receive the care he deserved not as transaction, but as acknowledgement that his injury mattered, that the young man's future had value that hadn't been properly recognized when he'd become just another casualty statistic in reports about territorial expansion and market control. But beyond Marcus's care, Bramwell had continued. He wanted Cassidy to stay if she could find any way to forgive enough to continue working with Addie, who needed her in ways that transcended all the adult complications surrounding their arrangement. He wasn't asking for absolution, or pretending that financial support erased moral responsibility for what his organization had done to her family. He was simply asking if space existed for repair alongside accountability, if she could separate her care for Addie from the justified anger she carried toward him, and the world he'd built through choices that prioritized power over consideration of human cost. Cassidy had set the folder on his desk, her hands trembling slightly as she'd processed information that rearranged possibilities she'd already mourned as lost. She'd asked what would happen to the cameras, her gesture encompassing the monitors that represented his need for control and inability to trust anyone without verification and constant surveillance. The question had been a test, Bramwell had recognized, asking if he was willing to surrender the security system that had been his primary tool for managing fear and maintaining illusion of protection against threats both real and imagined. He'd moved to the keyboard and begun shutting down feeds, watching screens go dark one by one as he'd systematically disabled the system he'd spent thousands installing just weeks ago. The nursery feed had been last, the image of Addie sleeping peacefully, disappearing into blackness that represented leap of faith his nature resisted, but his heart recognized as necessary for anything real to develop. Cassidy had watched the monitors die without speaking, her expression unreadable as she'd witnessed his demolition of the fortress he'd built between himself and genuine vulnerability. When the last screen had gone dark, Bramwell had turned back to Cassidy and told her the surveillance had never shown him what mattered anyway, had captured surfaces while missing the depths where actual connection occurred beyond reach of cameras or monitoring equipment. He'd watched her care for Addie for weeks without understanding what he was seeing until her journal had provided context that surveillance alone couldn't reveal. The cameras had been security theater, creating illusion of control while actually preventing the trust that offered real protection through relationship rather than technology and distance. Cassidy had approached the darkened monitors, her fingers touching one screen as if confirming its inactivity was genuine rather than temporary theater meant to manipulate her emotions. She'd asked if he understood that what she needed wasn't just financial compensation for Marcus, or destruction of surveillance systems, but actual change in how he understood his responsibility to people affected by his business operations. The folder represented a beginning, she'd acknowledged, but it couldn't be the end of his moral reckoning if she was going to trust him with access to her time with Addie, or believe that his concern was authentic rather than simply motivated by desire to retain effective employee. Bramwell had agreed to whatever terms she set, recognizing he was negotiating from a position of complete disadvantage, and that any opportunity she offered was more than his actions had earned. Cassidy had outlined expectations that went far beyond their employer-employee relationship into territory that required his transformation, rather than just behavioral adjustment. She wanted regular reports about organizational changes that reduced risk to uninvolved bystanders, wanted evidence that Marcus's case wasn't isolated generosity, but beginning of systemic rethinking about acceptable costs of business expansion and territorial control. More personally, she'd required he spend actual time with Addie, rather than observing her through monitors, that he learned to be present as a father, instead of delegating all emotional labor to hired caregivers while maintaining distance that prevented genuine attachment. The demand had been harder to accept than financial commitments or operational changes, requiring vulnerability he'd spent decades avoiding through strategic detachment from anything that might hurt if lost. But Cassidy had been inflexible on this point, insisting that Addie deserved a parent who engaged directly rather than managing her upbringing like business operation, conducted through intermediaries and surveillance technology. The negotiations had extended past midnight, both of them exhausted but unwilling to leave details undefined that might create future conflicts or misunderstandings about expectations. When they'd finally reached agreement that felt sustainable, Cassidy had retrieved her backpack from the entrance hall where she'd left it hours earlier. But instead of departing, she'd asked if she could check on Addie one final time that evening, her need to confirm the baby slept peacefully, overriding her own exhaustion and desire to escape into sleep that might process everything that had shifted so dramatically in single evening. The dismantling of the surveillance system had been completed over the weekend by the same security company that had installed it, their technicians clearly confused by the reversal, but professional enough not to question clients who paid premium rates for installation and removal within weeks. Bramwell had stood in the emptied security room watching them remove the final pieces of equipment, the space transforming from command center to ordinary office that would need new purpose, now that monitoring was no longer his primary occupation. The loss of the cameras had created anxiety he hadn't anticipated, sudden vulnerability to threats he could no longer track or prevent through constant awareness of every corner of his environment. But the anxiety had been matched by unexpected relief, freedom from the exhausting vigilance that had consumed hours each day without actually making him feel safer or more in control. He'd realized the surveillance had been feeding his paranoia, rather than alleviating it, each camera creating new things to worry about and scrutinize, rather than providing the security it had promised. Living without the monitors forced him to trust his own judgment, and more frighteningly, to trust Cassidy without verification of her every action and interaction with his daughter throughout the day. Monday morning had brought Cassidy back to work under the new arrangement they'd negotiated, her arrival carrying different energy now that employment was choice, rather than desperate financial necessity. She'd greeted him with cautious warmth that acknowledged their complicated history, while moving forward with intention to build something different from what had existed before. Bramwell had committed to joining her for Addie's morning routine, his presence initially awkward, as he'd attempted to participate in caregiving activities he'd only observed through screens, without understanding their physical reality or emotional texture. Addie had been startled by his participation, her eyes tracking between Cassidy and Bramwell with uncertainty about this change in established patterns she'd come to rely on for security. But Cassidy had guided him through the routine with patience that made space for his inexperience without judgment, her instructions clear, and her expectations reasonable for someone learning to be present rather than simply observing from distance. He'd fumbled through diaper changes and feeding, his expensive suits entirely inappropriate for the messy reality of infant care that couldn't be delegated without losing essential aspects of the parent-child relationship. The first week had been humbling in ways Bramwell hadn't experienced since his early career, when he'd been building rather than managing his empire through subordinates and intermediaries. He'd discovered muscles that ached from carrying Addie, patience he didn't know he possessed when she'd fussed during routine tasks, tenderness that emerged when she'd finally smiled at him with recognition, rather than polite tolerance. Cassidy had documented his progress in her notebook alongside Addie's development, creating parallel narratives of growth that intertwined father and daughter in shared journey toward connection neither had known was possible. The rehabilitation facility where Marcus resided had received first payment from the account Bramwell had established, the funds accompanied by letter from him personally acknowledging his organization's role in creating circumstances that led to the shooting. He'd offered no excuses or justifications, simply statement of responsibility and commitment to supporting Marcus's recovery through whatever resources were needed. The letter had felt inadequate even as he'd written it, words unable to carry the weight of genuine remorse or repair damage that extended far beyond what money could address. But it was beginning of accountability he'd never practiced before in his professional life. Cassidy had visited Marcus that weekend and returned Monday with complicated emotions written across her features, despite her attempts to maintain professional composure. Her brother had been suspicious of Bramwell's sudden involvement, questioning whether the support came with expectations of silence or cooperation that would compromise his sister's safety or integrity. Marcus had grown protective during his recovery, Cassidy had explained, worried about her working for someone whose world had destroyed his body and their family's financial stability in single violent moment that had rearranged both their futures completely. Bramwell had suggested meeting Marcus directly, offering to answer questions and allow the young man to assess his sincerity without filters or intermediaries that might obscure actual intentions. Cassidy had been uncertain about the wisdom of such confrontation, worried it would devolve into accusations and anger that served no productive purpose, but she'd agreed to arrange introduction if Marcus was willing, acknowledging that direct conversation might provide clarity that couldn't be achieved through secondhand reports or financial transactions that maintained distance between those responsible and those harmed by organizational decisions. The meeting had been scheduled for a Thursday afternoon at the rehabilitation facility, neutral territory where Marcus felt secure and supported by staff who'd witnessed his progress over months of grueling recovery. Bramwell had arrived alone, deliberately leaving behind the security personnel who normally accompanied him to any location that could present vulnerability or risk. The gesture had been noted by facility staff and by Marcus himself, whose eyes had tracked the entrance for backup that never appeared, bodyguards absent in ways that spoke to Bramwell's willingness to be exposed without the protection his wealth and position normally provided. Marcus had been in physical therapy session when Bramwell had been shown to the visiting area, his damaged body moving through exercises with determination that was visible even from a distance. The young man's progress was remarkable according to therapists Bramwell had spoken with on the phone, his recovery exceeding initial projections that had been cautiously pessimistic about his eventual mobility and independence. But the success came from Marcus's relentless work, rather than any miraculous healing. Months of pain and frustration translated into incremental improvements that added up to meaningful reclamation of function doctors had thought permanently lost. When Marcus had joined him, wheeling himself into the private room the facility had provided for their conversation, Bramwell had been struck by the intelligence and wariness in the young man's eyes. This wasn't someone who'd been broken by his experience, but rather someone who'd been forged harder by it, steel refined in fires that would have destroyed lesser spirits. Marcus had greeted him with cool politeness that made clear this meeting was being granted as favor to Cassidy, rather than because Marcus sought anything from the man whose organization had destroyed his previous life trajectory and aspirations. Bramwell had spoken plainly about his responsibility for creating conditions that led to the shooting, explaining the territorial expansion decisions without attempting to minimize their consequences or present them as unfortunate accidents beyond anyone's control. He'd detailed the operational changes he was implementing to prevent similar incidents, transparency about his business. Marcus clearly hadn't expected from someone in his position. The honesty seemed to catch Marcus off guard, disrupting the adversarial dynamic he'd prepared for in favor of conversation that acknowledged shared reality. Neither could change, but both could learn from moving forward. Marcus had asked what Bramwell wanted from this accountability, whether the financial support came with expectations of Marcus's silence or Cassidy's continued loyalty, despite justified anger about his organization's role in their family's suffering. The question had been direct in ways Bramwell's usual business negotiations never allowed, cutting through polite fictions to core issues about power and obligation. Bramwell had assured him the support was unconditional, that Cassidy's employment remained her choice without pressure to remain in position, that required daily interaction with someone whose world had caused such profound damage. The conversation had extended beyond the scheduled hour, both men discovering unexpected common ground in their protective feelings toward Cassidy and their recognition of her strength despite circumstances that would have justified collapse. Marcus had shared stories about their childhood, the ways Cassidy had essentially raised him after their parents' deaths, her sacrifice of her own educational and career aspirations to ensure he had opportunities she'd surrendered. The picture Marcus painted revealed depths to Cassidy's character that surveillance had never captured, and her own reticence hadn't disclosed. History of selflessness that explained her capacity for love, that transcended circumstances that should have fostered only bitterness. Before Bramwell had departed, Marcus had said something that stayed with him during the drive back to the mansion and through the sleepless night that followed. He'd told Bramwell that Cassidy had spent her whole life taking care of people who needed her, that maybe what she deserved was someone who took care of her for once, instead of the other way around. The statement had been both observation and challenge, Marcus setting expectations for how his sister should be treated moving forward by anyone who wanted meaningful place in her life, beyond simple employment arrangement. The words had triggered recognition in Bramwell about how he'd been approaching his relationship with Cassidy, still treating their arrangement as primarily transactional. Despite the emotional complexity that had developed around Addie's care, he'd been focused on retaining valuable employee rather than seeing Cassidy as person with needs beyond financial compensation and professional respect. The shift in perspective required acknowledging that his feelings had evolved beyond employers' appreciation into something more personal that terrified him precisely because it couldn't be controlled or managed through contracts and surveillance systems. That evening, Bramwell had found Cassidy in the library after she'd finished Addie's bedtime routine, curled in the chair where he'd discovered her journal weeks earlier. She'd been reading one of the Italian poetry collections from his shelves, books he'd inherited from his grandmother, but never opened despite the cultural heritage they represented. Seeing Cassidy engaged with that forgotten part of his family history had created a moment of connection that transcended their complicated employer-employee dynamic and touched something deeper about shared cultural roots neither of them had fully embraced. He'd asked if she'd like dinner, not the formal meal they sometimes shared with Addie, but something casual where they could talk without professional boundaries rigidly maintained. Cassidy had accepted with surprise that suggested such invitations hadn't been part of their established pattern, her guard lowering slightly as she'd recognized his offer as personal rather than professional courtesy. They'd eaten in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, the informal setting creating space for conversation that ranged beyond Addie's care into their separate histories and the experiences that had shaped who they'd become. Bramwell had found himself sharing stories about his childhood and the immigrant grandparents who'd instilled ambition that became drive for empire building without teaching ethical frameworks to guide that ambition's expression. He talked about the loneliness of his position, the isolation that came from being feared and respected but never truly known by people, who saw only his power and resources rather than the uncertainty underneath. Cassidy had listened without judgment, her empathy creating safety he hadn't experienced since before he'd learned to view vulnerability as weakness that enemies exploited without mercy. She'd shared her own struggles with the burden of responsibility Marcus's injury had placed on her, the guilt she carried about moments when she resented having to be strong when she wanted permission to collapse. The confession had come haltingly, as though admitting anything less than complete capability felt like betrayal of the role she'd been filling since childhood. Bramwell had recognized the impossible standard she held herself to, the way she'd internalized others' needs as more important than her own, until she'd nearly disappeared beneath the weight of everyone else's expectations and dependencies. The evening had extended past midnight, both of them surprised by how natural the conversation felt once professional roles had been set aside. Bramwell had walked Cassidy to her car when she'd finally acknowledged the late hour, the gesture old-fashioned in ways that felt appropriate given the shift in their relationship's tenor. Standing in the driveway under stars obscured by city lights, he'd thanked her for giving him chance to prove he was capable of change, for seeing potential in him that he'd stopped believing existed beneath the person his choices had calcified him into becoming. The transformation of the mansion happened gradually over the following months, spaces that had been cold showplaces becoming warm environments where life actually occurred, rather than being staged for impression management. Cassidy had introduced plants to rooms that had been sterile, brought color to hallways that had been neutral, created atmosphere that invited presence rather than demanding the reverent distance-expensive decor typically imposed. Bramwell had initially resisted the changes that felt like loss of control over his carefully curated environment, but had learned to appreciate how Cassidy's touches made the house feel inhabited rather than simply occupied by people passing through without leaving meaningful marks. Addie's development had accelerated under the combined attention of both Cassidy and Bramwell, her vocalizations becoming more complex as she'd been encouraged by dual audiences invested in her progress. She'd begun pulling herself up using furniture, her upper body strength translating into mobility that doctors had suggested might be possible with intensive therapy and supportive environment. The achievement had been celebrated with tears from all three of them, recognition that this small victory represented Addie's determination, as much as the care she'd received from adults who'd learned to work together, rather than maintaining separate spheres of responsibility. Bramwell had begun spending mornings working from the nursery rather than his isolated office, his laptop balanced while Addie played nearby under Cassidy's supervision. The proximity had allowed him to witness developments he would have missed through surveillance, small moments that didn't register as significant enough to review on footage, but accumulated into understanding of his daughter's personality. She was funny and stubborn, he'd discovered, with clear preferences she'd express through sounds and gestures that required interpretation from people who'd invested time in learning her communication style and individual quirks. The operational changes Bramwell had implemented in his business were creating ripples through his organization, challenging assumptions about acceptable costs and necessary violence that had gone unquestioned for years. He'd begun requiring impact assessments before territorial expansions, demanding information about who would be affected and what measures could minimize harm to uninvolved community members. The new policies had created friction with subordinates who'd operated under different ethical frameworks, but Bramwell had been willing to accept resignations from those unwilling to adapt to expectations that valued human life alongside profit margins and market control. Marcus had been released from the rehabilitation facility to transitional housing that would support his continued recovery while allowing greater independence than institutional setting permitted. Bramwell had arranged for accessible apartment and ongoing therapy, involvement that had evolved from guilt-driven compensation into genuine investment in the young man's future. Marcus remained cautious in his interactions, appropriately skeptical about whether Bramwell's changes were sustainable or simply performance meant to secure Cassidy's loyalty, but he'd acknowledged the effort represented more than he'd expected from someone in Bramwell's position. Cassidy's relationship with Bramwell had deepened in ways neither had anticipated when she'd first knocked on his door seeking connection to the man whose world had destroyed her family. The anger that had motivated her initial employment had been complicated by growing affection for both Addie and, more surprisingly, for Bramwell himself, as he'd revealed capacity for growth she'd thought his years of moral compromise had eliminated. She'd found herself falling for someone she'd planned to hate. The complexity of that emotional reality creating internal conflict about whether loving him meant betraying Marcus, or whether humans could contain contradictions without being hypocrites. One evening in late spring, Bramwell had asked Cassidy to join him in the garden that sprawled behind the mansion, grounds that had been professionally maintained but never actually used by anyone who lived there. He'd had outdoor furniture arranged in an area overlooking fountain that provided white noise privacy from potential eavesdroppers, even though the surveillance system no longer existed to record private conversations. The gesture toward privacy had been noted by Cassidy, who'd followed him outside with curiosity, tempered by wariness about conversations held in deliberately isolated settings away from Addie's needs that might interrupt. Bramwell had told her he'd been thinking about family, and what that word meant beyond biological connection or legal obligation, how the past months had taught him that family was constructed through choice and daily commitment, rather than simply inherited through circumstance. He'd watched her build family with Addie through patient care and genuine love, had learned from her example that relationships were actions rather than feelings, verbs rather than nouns that required continuous conscious effort. The speech had been longer than he'd intended, nervous energy making him verbose when he'd meant to be concise and direct. What he'd been trying to articulate, he'd finally managed, was that he'd like to ask her to become family officially, rather than just functionally, to marry him, not because convention demanded it, but because he wanted legal recognition of the bond that had developed between them, despite all the reasons it shouldn't exist. The proposal had been awkward, lacking the smooth confidence he typically brought to important negotiations, his vulnerability visible in ways that made the question genuine rather than strategic move designed to secure valuable asset or solve logistical problem about Addie's care. Cassidy had been silent long enough that Bramwell had started preparing for rejection, his mind already cataloging how they'd navigate continued working relationship after she'd declined his offer. But when she'd finally spoken, her answer had been yes, wrapped in conditions that made clear what kind of marriage she was agreeing to enter. She wanted partnership with equal voice in decisions, wanted integration into his life that went beyond convenient arrangement for Addie's benefit, wanted honesty, even when truth was uncomfortable, or reflected badly on choices he'd made in his business operations that she'd become morally entangled with through their relationship. The wedding had been small, held in the mansion's garden with only Marcus and a handful of others present to witness their vows. Addie had been there in special chair that supported her limited mobility, her presence transforming the event from adult ceremony into family formation that included all three of them. The child had vocalized during the vows, her sounds interpreted as approval by everyone present, participation that added levity to otherwise solemn occasion. Bramwell had written his own vows, speaking about redemption and second chances, about how Cassidy had taught him that surveillance couldn't replace trust and control wasn't substitute for genuine connection. Cassidy's vows had addressed the complications of their history, acknowledging the pain that remained alongside the love that had grown in spaces she'd been surprised to find existed in both of them. She'd spoken about forgiveness being process rather than single decision, about choosing daily to move forward despite justified anger about past that couldn't be changed. Her words had been honest in ways that made some guests uncomfortable, her refusal to pretend their story was simple romance when it was actually complex negotiation between justice and mercy, between holding accountable and allowing transformation. The reception had been underway when Addie had pulled herself up using her chair, standing with support in ways she'd been practicing but never quite achieved with such stability. Everyone had frozen, watching her wobble slightly before finding balance that held despite gravity trying to pull her back down. She'd taken one step, then another, moving toward where Cassidy and Bramwell stood together watching their daughter accomplish what doctors had said would require years of additional therapy if it became possible at all. The room had erupted in cheers that Addie had responded to with a smile of pure triumph, her awareness that she'd done something remarkable visible in her expression. She'd reached Cassidy and Bramwell and wrapped her small arms around both their legs, holding on while they'd knelt to embrace her properly. The moment had been captured by photographer Bramwell had hired, but he'd been fully present for it rather than watching through camera lens or monitor screen, his direct experience of his daughter's achievement unmediated by technology or distance that would have diluted the emotional impact. In the months following the wedding, the former surveillance room had been transformed according to Cassidy's vision into bright space, filled with Addie's artwork and materials for creative projects. The monitor's absence had initially left walls looking bare and purposeless, empty surfaces that needed new identity. Cassidy had painted over the institutional gray with warm yellow that caught morning light, had installed shelving for books and supplies, had created an environment that celebrated Addie's growing capabilities rather than documenting her limitations through clinical observation and constant monitoring. Bramwell had begun spending time in that repurposed room with Addie, helping her with art projects that had no therapeutic goal beyond simple enjoyment and self-expression. He'd learned to value the mess that creative work generated, the way paint ended up on clothes and floors despite precautions meant to contain it. The imperfection had been liberating rather than stressful, teaching him that control over outcomes was less important than presence during process, that being there mattered more than ensuring everything happened according to predetermined plans and specifications. The business changes Bramwell had implemented had started attracting attention from law enforcement, who'd noticed shifts in his organization's patterns and wondered what had prompted reforms they'd been unable to force through prosecution or pressure. He'd cooperated with investigations into past operations more than his lawyers had recommended, accepting that accountability for previous actions was part of transformation rather than obstacle to be avoided through legal maneuvering. Several subordinates had faced consequences for violence Bramwell had previously shielded them from, his willingness to allow prosecution creating resentment among those who'd viewed his protection as an inviolable aspect of their employment in his organization. The tension had created real dangers that required ongoing vigilance without surveillance systems that had previously provided warning about developing threats. Bramwell had been forced to trust his instincts and the loyalty of people around him, learning to distinguish genuine concerns from paranoia that had previously driven his security decisions. Cassidy had been remarkably calm about risks that accompanied her marriage to someone with his history, her own experience with violence making her pragmatic, rather than fearful about possibilities that might never materialize despite being theoretically possible. Marcus had begun vocational training for career that would accommodate his physical limitations while utilizing his intelligence and determination that had driven his remarkable recovery. Bramwell had funded the education, while maintaining boundaries that respected Marcus's need for independence and autonomy, rather than creating obligation that might feel like another form of control. The young man had expressed cautious appreciation for support that came without strings attached, acknowledging Bramwell's efforts to repair damage while maintaining realistic assessment about whether money could truly compensate for what had been lost through injuries that would affect him permanently. Addie's third birthday had been celebrated with party that included children from neighborhood, Cassidy having connected with other parents through playground visits and activities that integrated Addie into broader community. Bramwell had watched his daughter interact with peers who accepted her differences without judgment or pity, kids who'd grown up alongside her adaptive equipment, and viewed her mobility aids as simply part of who she was, rather than defining her identity completely. The normalization had been gift Cassidy had given Addie through refusing to isolate her in protective environment that might have seemed safer, but would have limited her social development and sense of belonging. The garden where Bramwell had proposed had become family space rather than showpiece maintained for aesthetic value alone, area where they spent evenings together after Addie's bedtime routine. Bramwell and Cassidy had developed habit of reviewing their days there, sharing challenges and small victories that might seem insignificant individually, but accumulated into shared life they were building together. The conversations had depth that Bramwell's previous relationships had lacked, Cassidy's willingness to challenge him creating growth that flattery and deference would have prevented through letting him remain comfortable in patterns that no longer served who he wanted to become. One evening, several months after the wedding, Cassidy had told Bramwell she was pregnant. The news delivered with mixture of joy and apprehension about bringing another child into circumstances that remained complicated, despite improvements they'd achieved. Bramwell had been overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't immediately name, his reaction delayed while he'd processed information that represented both promise and responsibility. When he'd finally found words, he'd assured her they would face whatever challenges arose together, that their family would expand with same intentionality they'd brought to building what already existed between them and Addie. The pregnancy had progressed without complications, Cassidy continuing to work with Addie while adapting activities to accommodate her changing body and energy levels. Bramwell had been attentive in ways he hadn't been during his previous relationship that had produced Addie, present for medical appointments, and actively engaged in preparations for new arrival. He'd recognized this as opportunity to do better than he'd managed before, to be partner rather than observer of process that would transform their family configuration and dynamics in ways they couldn't fully anticipate. Thank you all for following this story of redemption, trust, and the families we choose to build despite complicated histories. If you've connected with Bramwell, Cassidy, and Addie's journey, please write in the comments where you're watching from and what moments resonated most deeply with you. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support helps me continue bringing these stories of transformation and hope. Your engagement means everything as we explore together how love can grow even in the most unexpected places.
Зайдем, посмотрим, как у них трансляция началась. если вот рассматривать, я говорю, задумываясь о том, что прожитые типа 30 лет, так смотришь на многих людей, которые сейчас, соответственно, живут, которым в районе 30, которые уже потеряли вообще вкус к жизни, да, радость какую-то от жизни. Таких, причем, кстати, становится все больше и больше. Мне кажется, этот средний возраст, когда говорили, что начинается вот этот кризис среднего возраста, он тоже сместился, как и говорят, что сейчас люди, в принципе, быстрее взрослеют, быстрее осмысливают все, да, почему-то это всегда все в плохом больше ключе на самом деле, да, вот что сейчас дети, к примеру, быстрее взрослеют, вот, и мне кажется, кризис вот этот среднего возраста, он, наверное, тоже сместился, и вот я думаю, что он сместился где-то в районе 30 лет. Опять-таки, это тоже не со всеми, наверное, связано. Не у всех людей так, все люди разные. И как-то приходишь к той мысли о том, что помимо того, что люди сами по себе стали такие вот, наверное, депрессивные, да, времена такие сложные, да, вот это вот еще извне много каких вещей случается, на данный момент, которые людям усугубляют эту ситуацию на самом деле, вот этой депрессии, вот этих кризисов, да, каких-то переходных моментов в жизни. И непонятно, если конец этому всему, да, наступает для людей потом белая полоса в жизни, или они не могут выбраться из нее. Примеров достаточно на самом деле много. К примеру, вот сосед у меня есть такой хороший парень был. И есть, он хороший человек сам по себе. Но вот у него сейчас очень сложные времена такие, как бы дизмораль на него напала. О том, что он не реализовался в своей жизни к 30 годам, что жизнь у него кончена. И не может он выбраться из этой ситуации. Да? Как говорят, если мы говорим, что это мужики такие, да, типа слабые, да, какие-то, безморальные, как бы такие вот, что в основном это случается, наверное, зачастую, может быть, это у мужиков случается в этом возрасте, такой кризис, наверное, да, каких-то неудач в своей жизни, не пришедших ни к чему достойному и хорошему. Но вопрос в том, что это мужики такие, типа слабые, или времена такие стали, что если вот разобраться так, вот, например, возьмем даже с древних времен, когда человеку нужно было добывать пищу самому, да, там убивать мамонтов, мужику стоило там сходить на охоту. Да, на охоту он сходил, кого-то там добыл добычу, принес домой, да, что-то где-то там поделал дома, и все как бы. И это, возможно, как работа тоже на ежедневной основе, да, была. И как бы мужик в то время считался, еще воином были, они воинами были, не воевали, да. В любом случае, это все такая в основном физическая была работа, типа стратегии именно добычи пищи какой-то себе. Тут вот требовалось, возможно, какое-то знание, да, тут я не спорю. Но в основном это была физическая работа. Если взять, к примеру, не такие далекие времена, когда там люди вот только выходили из пещер, да, взять даже, допустим, 50 лет назад, 100 лет назад, да, когда люди работали на заводах, и что тогда считалось именно мужиком, да, таким. Разница была, наверное, нынешними временами в том, что если ты работал, к примеру, на заводе на каком-то, то тебе было этого всего достаточно. То есть ты уходил на завод, отработал свое время, да, пришел домой, какие-то тоже там, может, домашние дела, и, ну, и этого тебе было достаточно на самом деле. Как бы и все, и заключалась вся суть именно мужчин, ну вот, как бы устроиться главное на завод и работать физически, опять-таки, да, получить какое-то образование, так, ну, как бы среднеспециальное, к примеру, да, какой-нибудь токарь, идти на завод, отработать там 8-12 часов. Ну, это не легкая работа, я не спорю тоже с этим. Но опять-таки, этого зато было достаточно. Человек уходил, он отрабатывал там 12 часов и понимал, что ему будет всего достаточно. Ради этого и была, наверное, главная и основная мотивация. Да? И если перенесемся мы, наверное, в наше время уже, сейчас, на данный момент, то есть люди просто не знают на самом деле, как заработать. Как получить жилье, как получить новый автомобиль. То есть способов получения данного результата его нету как такового. Это говоря о том, что ты будешь ходить на работу по 8, по 12 часов, допустим, сутками там работать, да, ты не заработаешь на машину, заработаешь ты на нее через 5 лет, если ты там не будешь ни пить, ни есть, как бы, да. Ну ладно, если вообще не тратить деньги, то заработаешь год. Ну такого же невозможно, это же только где-то в сказках. С учетом нынешних трат, то есть даже при зарплате какой-то средней, там 100 тысяч рублей, ну где-то 60, где-то 70, где-то 80, возьмем от 60, наверное, до 120, то есть, к примеру, достижение результата такой, как, к примеру, квартира, недвижка какая-то своя, это кредиты, ипотеки, то есть вот здесь и сейчас ты берешь. И залазя все глубже и глубже, то есть, как сказать, взял ты, к примеру, себе недвижимость, да, в ипотеку, пусть оно будет так. Помимо тех трат, к примеру, помимо этой ипотеки, там, ремонт и так далее, тебе за эти 20 лет нужно и телефоны менять, и одежду менять, и так далее, там, кушать надо. Машины также в этот же момент менять тебе надо. И то есть это кабала на самом деле такая, она дизморальная. И к чему это все? Что же значит мужик в наше время, который ходит на завод, работает 12 часов, а денег у него все равно нету. Как бы добычу он принести уже не может, да? Ну типа он может сходить в лес, но от этого толку особо не будет. И, наверное, сам интернет, во-первых, расфорсил вот это вот все, то, что люди должны зарабатывать какие-то миллионы. Они должны зарабатывать. Это было бы шикарно, если бы каждый зарабатывал. Но каждый по своей сути не может столько зарабатывать, да, потому что не хватит денег, чтобы каждый столько. А может их и хватит, но никто никому не даст так зарабатывать. И вот возвращаясь, к примеру, к тому, что какая зарплата? 1300, наверное, должна быть в наше время, чтобы как бы себя, наверное, обеспечивать, да, хорошо, одному. И кто же тогда мужик в наше время? Типа, что он должен делать? Что он должен выполнять? Как бы, если он ходит на работу, но смысла от этого нету. Ну, как бы он есть, да, у тебя какой-то идет доход, но если его недостаточно. Смотришь другие профессии, другую работу, да,